Hi everyone, my name is Claire, and with during my mentorship research, I explored the roots behind South Korea's the roots behind South Korea's fertility collapse, and I specifically delved into the economic and sociocultural roots. So these were my main research questions. My overarching question was, what factors have caused South Korea's low fertility rate? And obviously, because that was very broad, I wanted to categorize it into different sections. So the first sub-question was, how do males and females view marriage and child rearing differently? And compared to other OECD countries, why is South Korea an outlier? Why is our birth rate so conspicuously low? And then finally, in what ways do Koreans possess certain beliefs about becoming parents and raising children and creating a family? So I decided that this topic was important to address because of how surprising and shocking this statistic was to not just me, but as a Korean, my government and the news was talking about it every single day. And so globally, a lot of modern industrialized countries have already experienced below replacement fertility rates, which is 2.1 children per woman. But South Korea is expected to be actually half its size in 2100. And although the government has spent over 200 billion on addressing this issue, in the first quarter of this year, our birth rate was still at 0.82, which isn't even one. And as you can see in this graph, compared to the rest of the world, Korea's has dropped very drastically low for the past like 50 decades. So this so I conducted an existing literature research to see what scholars have already proposed as possible explanations. And so for the economic factors, they said that the main reasons were housing costs, childcare, concerns about income and occupation, as well as uncertainty towards the future. So specifically, Korea is kind of notorious for its housing crisis right now, which is still soaring, and the government is unable to address it at this moment. And then also, Korea is also known for having a very high education expense, which is also exacerbated by its education culture. So parents feel a lot of pressure and burden to expend a lot of money in their children's education. And then finally, uncertainty towards the future. It appears that South Koreans usually tend to think about how their children are going to perform in the future economy. So that makes them more hesitant to have children if the current state of the economy isn't doing so well. And kind of relating to the economic factors, I touched on the sociocultural, which is that, Korea still has a very much traditional, like Confucianist society where women are still seen as primary caretakers and men are seen as breadwinners. And so, on the backdrop of like increasing number of women in the workforce, a very conservative society makes this hard for women to go about their workplace duties on top of balancing their household duties. And so this conflict um, decreases fertility rates, and scholars have proposed that until this conflict is addressed, meaning until everyone in the society believes that women can also contribute to the workforce, fertility rates will not increase. And then finally, there's a combined factor, which is motherhood penalties. And so, motherhood penalties essentially means that mothers aren't choosing to have children because they know that they'll have decreased income or decreased career opportunities after giving birth. So even like before they have children, they have chosen to not have children because they are well aware of these factors and these consequences. For my research methodology, I decided to do a hybrid interview method. And so I conducted both in-person and virtual interviews, approximately 40 minutes each. And they were all contacted by familial connections. And before the interview, I sent an ethics approval form to CCIR, and I also received each interviewee's consent form prior to every interview. The demographics of my interview population were mostly South Koreans, and that was a limitation, I guess, but at the same time, I was just focusing on South Korea. And there were six males, four females. Most were from the upper middle class, and most held non-traditional attitudes towards gender roles, and the age range was between 21 and 41. And I want to point out that in this demographic, I obviously had a limitation because I didn't have anyone from the middle or lower classes, as well as I had most of the people held non-traditional attitudes, so that skewed my data in a certain direction. And the types of questions I asked were a bit different for males and females, but in the end, there were overarching themes that I asked for both of them. And these themes consisted of Western influence, social media, generational beliefs, politics, housing education, work-life balance, feminism, manosphere, inequality, and social norms. So those were the overlapping themes. And specifically to the men, I asked them about what they think about masculinity, and victimhood, and also paternal responsibilities in Korea. And for women, I asked a similar range of questions relating to maternal responsibilities as well as their wage gap, because Korea, amongst the OECD countries, has one of the biggest wage gap between female and males to this day. So I wanted to see um, how the interviewees felt about that. And so for my findings, I wanted to categorize them based on how I categorized my literature review, which was between economic and sociocultural. So this first part is related to economics specifically. And so a lot of my findings reflected existing literature claims. So for example, the interviewees have said that there is enormous price gap for houses in big and small cities. And so in big metropolitan areas like Seoul, the housing prices are inexplicably high as compared to smaller cities like Daegu. Um, there's way less pressure and also way less prices associated with good apartments. And there is generally a pressure to live in Seoul because Seoul is concentrated with the most profitable work opportunities as well as educational resources. So most families want to live in the same area, which again increases demand and therefore increases the prices even more. So it's like a vicious cycle. And then there's a part about misguided policy. So most respondents believe that the government is currently inefficiently tackling these problems, and they're only targeting really lower class couples, whereas leaving out like middle and upper middle couples who actually want children but are not qualified to receive any useful support from the government because their income already surpasses a certain level. So this was again an inefficient way. And like the literature has said, scholars have already noticed that Korea has a very poor housing system. And our public rental housing system and monitoring is very low quality even today. And so that limits parents' desires to want to have children even more. And then the economic part was actually not the main focus of the interviewees' responses because most of them focused on the sociocultural factors. So, firstly, there were cultural connections to economic concerns. So, a lot of respondents pondered whether economic policies like giving more incentives to parents or maybe giving free education, will that actually address these low fertility rates? And there were mixed perspectives. Some believe that yes, it could, and some believe that no, Korea has already surpassed that level where this issue is like unfixable. It's like irrecoverable. So the literature has also said that in order for fertility rates to change, you can't just have improved economic policies, but cultural norms, such as like our very strong Confucianist culture, needs to change in tandem. And another part was about competitive education, like I've mentioned. And so parents are worried about their children's future stress. And there's a culture of helicopter parenting where most parents believe that they are responsible for providing their children with the best education possible. And if they fail to do so, if they fail to provide them with the most profitable opportunities, they feel stressed out and they feel like they haven't done their job. And so that again increases the burden and decreases fertility intentions. And in Korea, one's grade and alma mater determines individual's life path. And I know that many other countries have similar cultures, but Korea has been especially um, noted for having a strong culture tied around grades and where you graduated undergrad. And then there's a culture of comparison and peer pressure, which also exists in many different cultures. But in Korea, there's a specific word called nunchi, which is this like perpetuated atmosphere in everyday situations where people are always constantly worried about what other people are thinking of them and what other people are doing. So they feel pressure to always copy and mimic what other people are buying, what how they're living, how they're raising their children. And so this fear of like diverging from the norm makes them even more hesitant to have children because they're thinking like, oh, if I have children, will I be able to send them to these prestigious academies and prestigious tutoring centers that all other people are doing? So this again reinforces how like economic and cultural concerns are correlated. And then there was more about sociocultural factors such as gender conflicts. So originally in existing literature, the gender conflicts appear to be a very big part about why Korea has experienced decreasing fertility because men have felt like Korean women are taking advantage of their gender and trying to unfairly gain advantages, and so they felt victimized, especially because Korea has a military service that's only mandatory for men. And so the men felt victimized, leaving men to feel like, oh, if I have a wife and child, like I'll be taken advantage of. But in my interviewee's response, this wasn't a very significant aspect. In fact, like both men and women said that feminism or misogyny is both not a significant factor to fertility rates. And then there was another factor about social media. And social media came out as a big factor because a lot of dramas, blogs, and daily news on Korean websites that are easily accessible and also rapidly spread around like gossip. These types of media tend to promote a luxurious lifestyle for parents, such as like living in, like 50-floor apartments with a great view with their children, top of the class. And so this sort of media increases and exacerbates parents' burden again to have children. Another two important aspect about sociocultural factors was Korea's long-standing overworking culture at work. So, since the 1950s, after the Korean War and after Japanese occupation, Korea sought to rapidly advance its economy. And one way of doing that was by having very long working hours and, you know, sacrificing one's health, one's mental health, one's family to work overtime in order to produce like the maximum economic profit. And so, although that has obviously alleviated throughout the years as Korea became a very modern, industrialized country, this culture still is very prevalent in Korea. And so, mothers especially doubt whether they can balance overworking and also taking care of their children. And then there's this rise of individualism, which is the opposite of Confucianism, where you're not prioritizing family values, you're not always listening to what your parents are saying, you're listening to your own goals and trying to pursue your own personal hobbies. And so this shift to individualism has contradicted Confucianist culture, making it even harder for individuals to like navigate their values in a very conservative society. And this was also reflected in existing literature as well. Now, moving on specifically to males, there was only two parts: military service and patriarchal norms. So, like I've mentioned, males feel that Korea's military service, that's only mandatory for men, is doing them a disadvantage and that the government is not providing them enough provisions for them to earn money and get jobs after their service, which makes them unappealing partners for potential wives. And also, it kind of decreases their confidence about finding a partner. And there's patriarchal norms, for example, like men are breadwinners, so they need to work overtime. They can't use parental leaves because that is seen as being unmasculine or weak. And so this perception further thwarts their ability to want to have children because they feel like they don't want to conform to this norm. And then finally, the females offered a different set of explanations to why they feel like Korea is having decreased birth rates. And the first was distrust in society. So there's been a rise in anti-feminist acts in Korea ever since like the 2010, Me Too movement and also 4B movement in Korea. So there was a rising skepticism of whether Korean women and their children are able to live in a safe society in the future. And there was a part about motherhood and gender roles, which basically they felt that if they used maternal leave, they would face discrimination and they would be promoted less often than their male counterparts, or maybe even, revoked from high-paying jobs and left to surrender to like low-paying jobs and looked down upon by their bosses. So this again falls into the category of motherhood penalties. So their perceived career interruptions makes them want to not have children. And this was again emphasized by existing literature, where scholars have showed that the more females believe that they're going to face discrimination, it's more likely that they're not going to have children. And so, to conclude all of my research, there were some main findings and contributions that my research had. Firstly, a large part of my research confirmed existing literature in that Korea has a very competitive society that is still fixated on a Confucianist and patriarchal culture that values high academic competition, that values, traditional gender norms. And this, in contrast, conflicts with the growing individuality and the growing Western values that Koreans have adopted over the past couple of years. And this conflict, in the end, makes fertility rates even harder to address. And this was one, this like conflict was again already found in my existing literature. And one contradiction to the literature that I found was that gender wars and conflicts are not as significant as previously thought. So it's not that females and males in Korea hate each other and they don't want to marry and they're not finding adequate partners. It's that it's not about the tension between the genders, it's about the tension between individuals and the society rather. So that was one significant contribution that my study founded. And then for my limitation was that I only conducted 10 interviews, like I said, due to time and resource constraints, and most of them were from privileged backgrounds who possess non-traditional attitudes. So if I had interviewed a more diverse population, I could have easily received different responses. And so in the future, I suggest that scholars exploring similar topics may benefit from focusing on researching young adults' attitudes and socialization how they come to develop certain ideas about careers, about parenthood, about work, and also interviewing a more diverse sample from people employed in different regions. For example, big cities, small cities, and also different types of companies like public sectors and private sectors. And lastly, it's crucial to investigate how tightly housing costs are actually intertwined with culture, because recent news has said that housing costs may be its own problem and that it's actually not related to culture, and it's more related to economics and how the government deals with it. So that was my conclusion, and these were all my resources. Is there any questions? If there are no other questions, I guess, am I
Yeah,
thank you so much
I'll
for
ask
listening.
you I'll ask you one question. And what did you find sort of the most challenging part about your research or the program, or sort of working through with CCIR? Was there anything that stood out as particularly challenging for you?
Well, for me, this was like my first real academic research, so it was hard balancing this and school.
Mm-hmm.
And academic writing for a research paper is very different from like, literature writing or creative writing. So I kind of had to have a different mindset and approach when approaching this. So it made me think very much more critically about everything I did, making sure I'm not, citing the wrong sources, making sure I'm like understanding others' claims correctly. And so like these little parts about academic research was challenging, but in the end, I think it served a really good experience for me.
And that's very good to hear. And I think you brought it around very well to all of us in a very clear and concise manner. So thank you for your time, Kay.
Thank you.
Um, we'll see whoever in the next session.
Thank you.